In 1911, a wedding photograph captured what should have been pure joy, a couple surrounded by family, flowers fresh, smiles bright. But when the image was developed, something unsettling emerged. The godmother's expression didn't match the celebration around her. Her eyes held something darker, fear mixed with guilt, a secret pressed behind forced lips. As years passed and neighbors whispered, that single photograph became evidence of something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined on that seemingly perfect day. If you enjoy mysteries that blur the line between reality and the unexplained, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The morning of June 3rd, 1911, arrived with unusual clarity in the small town of Bellwood, Massachusetts. Catherine Morrison stood before the mirror in her family's modest Victorian home, her wedding dress, borrowed from a cousin in Boston, fitting her slender frame perfectly. The lace collar touched her collarbone, and the pearl buttons her mother had sewn on the night before caught the early sunlight streaming through the window. Outside, the town was already stirring. Bellwood, with its population of barely 3,000 souls, rarely saw excitement beyond the occasional traveling show or church social. A wedding was an event that brought everyone together, and the Morrison-Blackwell union had been the talk of the town for months. Catherine's hands trembled as she fastened the final button. She was 22 years old, considered nearly past marrying age by local standards. Her father, Thomas Morrison, ran the general store on Main Street, a respectable position that nonetheless left the family perpetually one bad season away from hardship. The winter of 1910 had been particularly brutal, and whispers of debt had followed Thomas through town like shadows. Eleanor Whitmore, Catherine's godmother, entered the room without knocking. She was an imposing woman in her late 40s, widow of the town's former mayor and owner of considerable property along the river. Her dark dress contrasted sharply with Catherine's white gown, and her expression was unreadable as she surveyed her goddaughter. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said, though her voice carried no warmth. She placed a small velvet box on the vanity. "Your mother asked me to give you this." Catherine opened the box to find a simple gold locket worn smooth by time. Inside was a photograph of her grandmother, stern-faced and dignified. She fastened it around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her chest like a stone. "Are you certain about this?" Eleanor asked suddenly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Catherine's reflection in the mirror showed a face too pale, eyes too wide. "It's done, Eleanor. The arrangements have been made." "Arrangements," Eleanor repeated bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Catherine could respond, her younger sister Mary burst into the room, all excited energy and ribbons. "They're ready for you. Father is waiting downstairs, and half the town is already at the church." The ceremony took place at St. Augustine's, the town's only Catholic church, a stone building that had stood since 1847. James Blackwell waited at the altar, 34 years old, recently arrived from New York City with mysterious wealth and even more mysterious business interests. He was handsome in a sharp-edged way, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his hair pomaded to perfection. When Catherine walked down the aisle on her father's arm, James's smile didn't reach his eyes. The vows were exchanged with mechanical precision. Father McMahon's voice echoed through the church as he pronounced them husband and wife. The kiss was brief, formal, witnessed by 200 townspeople who clapped politely, unaware of the undercurrents swirling through the wedding party. After the ceremony, everyone gathered outside for the photograph. This was a significant expense. The photographer, Mr. Henrik Paulson, had traveled from Boston specifically for the occasion, bringing his large-format camera and glass plates. In 1911, photographs were still precious commodities, especially for working families like the Morrisons. "Everyone gather close," Paulson instructed, setting up his tripod on the church lawn. The bride and groom in the center, family arranged around them. "Hold very still. The exposure will take several seconds." Catherine and James stood at the heart of the composition. Thomas Morrison and his wife stood to Catherine's right, Mary beside them. James's mother, who had arrived from New York the day before, positioned herself on his left, and there, just behind Catherine's shoulder, stood Eleanor Whitmore, the godmother, placed prominently as befitted her status as the wedding's primary sponsor. "Hold still now," Paulson called out, ducking beneath his camera's dark cloth. "No one move." The world seemed to freeze in that moment. Catherine felt James's arm around her waist, possessive and cold even through the layers of fabric. She could sense Eleanor behind her, could almost feel the weight of her godmother's gaze boring into the back of her head. The June sun was warm, but Catherine felt ice in her veins. The shutter clicked. Time released them. "Perfect," Paulson announced, emerging from beneath his cloth. "I'll have the plates developed and delivered within the week. Udi, if you're intrigued by where this story is heading, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps." The reception was held at the Morrison home, modest but crowded with well-wishers. Tables groaned under donated food, roasted chicken, fresh bread, pies made by neighboring women. A violin player provided music, and despite the underlying tensions, the celebration proceeded as such things did in small towns, with forced gaiety and too much whiskey. Catherine moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting congratulations she didn't feel, smiling until her face ached. James played his role perfectly, the attentive groom, charming the townspeople with stories of New York City, carefully edited, Catherine suspected, to hide whatever business had truly brought him to Bellwood. As the afternoon wore on, she found Eleanor standing alone in the kitchen, staring out the window at the garden where Catherine had played as a child. "It's done now," Catherine whispered. Eleanor turned to face her, and for the first time Catherine saw tears in her godmother's eyes. "Yes," Eleanor said. "God forgive us both, but it's done." What arrangement had truly been made? What had driven Catherine Morrison into the arms of a stranger? The wedding photograph, still developing in Henrik Paulson's darkroom in Boston, would soon reveal more than anyone expected, not in what it showed, but in what it captured in Eleanor Whitmore's face, frozen forever in that moment when the shutter fell. 7 days after the wedding, Henrik Paulson's assistant delivered the photograph to the Morrison household in a protective cardboard sleeve. Catherine was alone when it arrived. James had left early that morning for business in Boston, a pattern that had already established itself in their brief marriage. She signed for the package and carried it to the parlor, her hands unsteady. The photograph was larger than she'd expected, mounted on thick board, the image sharp and clear with that peculiar depth that distinguished Paulson's work from cheaper photographers. Catherine laid it on the table and simply stared. There they all were, frozen on that June day. Her father, attempting dignity despite the worry lines around his eyes. Her mother, proud in her best dress. Mary, young and innocent, still believing in fairy tales. James, his hand on Catherine's waist, his expression unreadable. And Catherine herself, looking every inch the bride, though now, viewing her own face from the outside, she could see what she'd felt. A certain emptiness behind the smile, a resignation. But it was Eleanor who commanded attention. The godmother stood just behind Catherine's right shoulder, positioned prominently in the composition, while everyone else had managed appropriate expressions: joy, pride, solemnity. Eleanor's face told a different story. Her mouth was set in what might have been intended as a smile, but her eyes were wide, almost fearful. There was something in her gaze, directed not at the camera but slightly to the side, toward James perhaps, or beyond him, to something outside the frame entirely. More unsettling was the quality of that gaze. It held guilt, unmistakable and raw. Not the gentle regret of a sentimental moment, but something darker, heavier. It was the look of someone who knew they had participated in something wrong and could do nothing to stop it. Catherine traced her finger along the edge of Eleanor's image, remembering her godmother's words in the kitchen. "God forgive us both, A knock at the door interrupted her examination. She quickly covered the photograph with a cloth and went to answer. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher stood on the porch, the town's most notorious gossip, holding a basket of what appeared to be muffins, but was certainly a pretext for information gathering. "Catherine, dear," Abigail said, already pushing past her into the house, "I wanted to welcome you properly as a married woman. Such a beautiful wedding. And that photograph, I heard it turned out wonderfully." Catherine's stomach tightened. "It just arrived." "Oh, may I see it?" "Henrik Paulson is such an artist." There was no polite way to refuse. Catherine led Abigail to the parlor and uncovered the photograph. The older woman bent close, studying every detail with the intensity of someone searching for secrets. "Remarkable clarity," Abigail murmured. Then she paused, her finger hovering over Eleanor's image. "How curious. What is?" "Eleanor's expression. She looks troubled. One might almost say frightened." Abigail's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of potential scandal. "I wonder what she was thinking at that moment." "I'm sure it was nothing," Catherine said quickly. "Perhaps the sun was in her eyes." But Abigail had latched onto something. "You know, there's been talk about how quickly this marriage came together. Your father's debts at the bank, and then this Mr. Blackwell appearing from nowhere with his money and his interest in you." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Some say Eleanor arranged the whole thing, that she knew Blackwell from somewhere, introduced him to your father when the store was about to be foreclosed." "Geez," Catherine felt blood drain from her face. "That's ridiculous gossip." "Is it?" Abigail straightened, satisfied she'd struck a nerve. "Well, I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent. Though I must say, Eleanor has been acting strangely since the wedding. Keeping to herself, not attending socials, almost as if she's ashamed of something." After Abigail finally left, taking her muffins and her suspicions with her, Catherine returned to the photograph. She stared at Eleanor's face, at that expression of fear and guilt, and felt something cold settle in her chest. The truth was simpler and more terrible than Abigail's gossip, though the old woman had stumbled close to it. 6 months earlier, when Thomas Morrison's debts had reached a breaking point, Eleanor had come to the family with a proposal. She knew a man, she said, a businessman from New York, seeking to establish himself in a respectable Massachusetts town. He needed the legitimacy of a good family connection. He was willing to pay handsomely for it. Catherine remembered that conversation in brutal detail. Her father, broken and desperate, barely able to meet her eyes. Her mother, crying silently in the corner. Eleanor, speaking in her practical, emotionless way about arrangements and mutual benefit. And Catherine herself, 22 years old and unmarried, understanding with terrible clarity what was being asked of her. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far. James Blackwell had come to Bellwood a week later. The courtship, if it could be called that, lasted 2 months. Long enough to appear respectable, short enough that Catherine never learned what business really brought him to their small town. He was charming when necessary, cold when they were alone, and his money was very real. The Morrison debts disappeared. The store was saved, and Catherine became Mrs. James Blackwell. Eleanor had arranged it all, used her connections and her knowledge of desperate people. And on the wedding day, when Henrik Paulson's camera captured that moment, Eleanor's carefully maintained composure had cracked just enough for the truth to bleed through. What was James Blackwell really? Why had he been so eager to buy his way into Bellwood society? What had Eleanor known about him that made her look so afraid? The photograph held these questions, frozen in silver and light, waiting for answers that would soon prove more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks after the photograph's arrival, the first sign that something was deeply wrong appeared in the form of Sarah Whitmore, Eleanor's 19-year-old niece from Providence. She arrived unannounced at the Morrison house, now technically the Blackwell residence, though Catherine still thought of it as her childhood home, on a grey Tuesday morning when James was away in Boston. Sarah looked haggard, her traveling clothes rumpled, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept. Catherine barely knew her. Eleanor kept her family at arm's length, rarely speaking of relatives. Yet here, Sarah stood on the doorstep, clutching a small carpet bag and looking over her shoulder as if being pursued. "I need to speak with you," Sarah said without preamble, "about your husband and about what my aunt has done." Catherine pulled her inside quickly, glancing at the empty street before closing the door. The walls of small towns had ears, and the last thing she needed was more fuel for Abigail Fletcher's gossip mill. In the parlor, Sarah collapsed into a chair as if her strings had been cut. Catherine brought tea, waiting as the younger woman gathered herself. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and fear. "My aunt sent me a letter last week," Sarah began. "Rambling, almost incoherent. She was drunk when she wrote it. I could tell from the handwriting. She was confessing something, Catherine. Something about your wedding, about a man named Blackwell." Catherine's hands tightened around her teacup. What did she say? That she'd made a terrible mistake. That she'd been desperate for money. Her late husband's estate wasn't as secure as everyone thought, apparently. She was facing her own debts, her own shame. And then James Blackwell contacted her. Contacted her? I thought she knew him from somewhere. Sarah shook her head. That's what she wanted everyone to think. But according to the letter, he found her. He somehow knew about her financial troubles, knew about your father's debts. He approached her with a proposal. He would pay her a substantial sum if she could arrange a marriage to a respectable young woman from a good family, a woman who would give him the appearance of legitimacy. The room seemed to tilt. Catherine set down her teacup before she dropped it. Why? Why would he need that? The letter didn't say exactly, but Eleanor wrote that she'd made inquiries after the wedding, once the money was in her hands, and her conscience started eating at her. She'd hired a private investigator in New York City to find out who James Blackwell really was. And Sarah's face had gone pale. The investigator disappeared, just vanished 3 days into his work. The last telegram he sent to Eleanor said he'd found something about Blackwell's business dealings that was worse than anyone suspected. Then nothing. Eleanor tried to contact him, went to his office in New York. His landlady said he'd left in the middle of the night without paying rent, taking nothing with him, just gone. Catherine felt ice spreading through her veins. She thought of James, his cold politeness, his unexplained absences, the way certain men looked at him in town, with a mixture of respect and fear that had nothing to do with his wealth. "There's more," Sarah continued. Eleanor mentioned the wedding photograph in her letter. She said when she saw it, she nearly fainted, because she realized the camera had captured what she'd been feeling at that exact moment, the full weight of what she'd done. She wrote that she looked guilty because she was guilty, and now there was a permanent record of it. "That's why she's been avoiding everyone," Catherine whispered. "The photograph shows the truth. She's terrified, Catherine. Terrified of what she's unleashed on you, on this town, and terrified of him." As if summoned by their words, the sound of a key turning in the front door lock echoed through the house. James was home early. Catherine and Sarah locked eyes, a moment of panic passing between them. "The back door!" Catherine hissed. "Go! Don't let him see you here!" Sarah grabbed her carpet bag and fled through the kitchen. Catherine heard the back door close just as James entered the parlor, removing his hat and gloves with his usual precise movements. "Catherine," he greeted her, his voice pleasant and empty. His eyes traveled around the room, noting the 2 teacups on the table. "Were you entertaining someone?" "Mrs. Fletcher stopped by earlier," Catherine lied, praying the tremor in her voice sounded like annoyance rather than fear. "With more gossip as usual." James smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He crossed to the mantelpiece, where the wedding photograph now stood in a prominent frame, his idea, not hers. He studied it for a long moment, his back to Catherine. "This photograph," he said softly, "it's quite remarkable, isn't it? The way Paulson captured every detail, every expression." He turned to face her. "Your godmother looks particularly memorable." as if she's seeing something the rest of us cannot. Catherine forced herself to meet his gaze. I hadn't noticed. No? He moved closer, and Catherine had to fight the urge to step back. I notice everything, Catherine. It's important in my line of work. What exactly is your line of work, James? The question escaped before she could stop it. James's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A calculation, a reassessment. Business, he said finally. Import and export. Investments. Nothing that would interest you. But his tone carried a warning. Don't ask again. That night, after James had gone to bed, Catherine lay awake in the darkness, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. A disappeared investigator, Eleanor's terror, a man who somehow knew exactly whose desperation to exploit, who could make people vanish without trace. What had Eleanor seen in that moment when the camera captured her expression? What truth about James Blackwell had her instincts recognized, even if her conscious mind hadn't understood it yet? And what would happen when that truth finally emerged from the shadows? The photograph on the mantelpiece held its secrets, Eleanor's guilty, fearful gaze frozen forever, a warning no one had heeded in time. The answers began to surface 2 months later, in ways no one could have anticipated. But they started with another photograph, or rather, with the absence of one. Henrik Paulsson's studio in Boston burned to the ground on a Wednesday night in August. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by improperly stored chemicals, though the speed with which the building was consumed raised eyebrows among the local fire brigade. Paulsson himself escaped with minor injuries, but his life's work, thousands of glass plate negatives, including the negative from the Morrison-Blackwell wedding, was destroyed completely. Catherine learned of it from a newspaper James had left on the breakfast table, seemingly by accident. She stared at the article, at the illustration of the burned-out building, and felt certainty settle in her bones. This was no accident. That same week, Eleanor Whitmore did something unprecedented. She came to Catherine's house in the middle of the day when she knew James would be away. She looked 10 years older than she had at the wedding, her face drawn, her hands shaking, as Catherine led her into the parlor. "He knows," Eleanor whispered, before Catherine could even close the door. "He knows I've been asking questions." "What happened?" Eleanor sank into a chair. 3 nights ago, someone broke into my house. Nothing was stolen, but my desk had been searched, papers scattered everywhere. They were looking for something. I think it was my correspondence, maybe the letter I'd sent to Sarah. She looked up at Catherine with hollow eyes. "He's warning me, showing me what he can do." "We need to go to the police," Catherine said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they were. Go to the police and tell them what? That her husband might have had something to do with a fire in Boston? That Eleanor had a feeling she was being watched? In 1911, in a small Massachusetts town, a wife's suspicions meant nothing against her husband's position and wealth. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "I've been doing research very carefully. James Blackwell isn't his real name." Catherine felt the room tilt. "What?" "I found a man in Boston, a different investigator, more careful than the first. He discovered that there was a James Blackwell who died in New York in 1908. Your husband took his identity, his papers, his credentials, everything. The real James Blackwell was a clerk, nobody important. He died of influenza and was buried in a pauper's grave. My husband..." She stopped herself. "Your husband simply became him. Then who is he really?" Eleanor shook her head. "That's what we don't know. The investigator thinks he might have been involved in some kind of criminal enterprise in New York. Something to do with the docks, smuggling perhaps, or worse. But everyone who might have known him from before is either gone or refuses to talk. It's as if there's a wall of fear around his past. If you're still watching and want to know how this ends, leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate your support." Catherine thought of the men who sometimes visited James, arriving late at night, speaking in low voices in his study. She thought of the locked trunk in their bedroom that she'd never been permitted to open. She thought of the way James could make people do things with just a look, the subtle menace that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "We have to do something," Catherine said. "We can't just wait for what?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "For him to decide we know too much? Catherine, I've condemned you to this. I sold you to a man who isn't even real, who's running from something so terrible that he had to completely erase who he was." They sat in silence for a long moment, two women trapped by choices made in desperation, by a society that gave them no power and no voice. "The photograph," Catherine said suddenly. "The one from the wedding. He had Paulson's studio burned, didn't he, to destroy the negative?" "I think so. But why?" "It's just a photograph." Catherine went to the mantelpiece and took down the framed print. She studied Eleanor's face, that captured moment of fear and guilt. "Because it shows the truth, because your expression in this photograph tells anyone who really looks at it that something was wrong. You weren't just uncomfortable, you were terrified. And that's dangerous to him. His whole existence here depends on appearing normal, respectable, above suspicion." Eleanor stared at the photograph, tears beginning to flow. "I thought I was just feeling guilty about the arrangement, about taking his money to push you into this marriage. But looking at it now, I think part of me knew. Some instinct recognized what he was, even if I couldn't articulate it." "What do we do?" Catherine asked. "How do we escape this?" But there was no answer. In 1911, a woman couldn't simply leave her husband. She had no legal rights, no financial independence. Divorce was scandal, practically unthinkable for a respectable family. And if James was truly as dangerous as they suspected, if he was willing to burn buildings and make investigators disappear, what would he do to a wife who tried to leave him? Eleanor departed shortly after, and Catherine was left alone with the photograph. She studied every detail of that captured moment, seeing now what the camera had preserved. Her father's barely concealed desperation, her mother's forced smile, Mary's innocent joy, not understanding what was really happening, and Eleanor's face, a mask of guilt and fear that told the whole terrible truth to anyone willing to see it. As evening fell and Catherine waited for James to return home, she wondered what would happen to this photograph eventually. Would it survive? Would someone years or decades from now look at it and see the mystery frozen in that moment? Would they understand that sometimes the camera captures more than images? It captures the precise second when fate is sealed and darkness wins. The sound of James's key in the lock made her jump. She placed the photograph back on the mantelpiece, arranging her face into the pleasant, empty expression he expected. But as she turned to greet her husband, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and saw something that chilled her blood. She was beginning to look like Eleanor in that wedding photograph, her eyes holding secrets too dangerous to speak, fear she couldn't acknowledge, guilt for all the warnings she'd ignored. What became of Catherine Morrison Blackwell? What became of Eleanor and Sarah, and the truth about the man who called himself James? The photograph offers no answers, only that single frozen moment of foreknowledge. Eleanor's face telling us that she saw what was coming, even if she couldn't stop it. Winter came early to Bellwood in 1911. By November, snow had already begun to fall, covering the town in a blanket of white that muffled sound and isolated houses from one another. Catherine watched it from her window, feeling more trapped with each passing day. The photograph remained on the mantelpiece, though James had stopped looking at it, or perhaps he had simply stopped doing so obviously. Catherine sometimes caught him staring at it when he thought she wasn't watching, his expression unreadable. Once she'd come downstairs in the middle of the night to find him standing before it in darkness, just the silhouette of him against the faint moonlight through the windows. In December, something happened that changed everything, or perhaps revealed that everything had already changed in ways they couldn't see. Sarah Whitmore returned to Bellwood, but not to visit. She came with 2 policemen and a lawyer from Providence, demanding to see Eleanor. They found her godmother's house empty, door unlocked, breakfast dishes still on the table from 3 days prior. Eleanor Whitmore had vanished. Catherine learned of it from Mary, who burst into the house breathless with news and concern. They're saying she might have run away, but Sarah insists something's happened to her. The police are talking to everyone, asking questions about Aunt Eleanor's state of mind. James was in Boston that day, or so he'd said. Catherine stood in their parlor, staring at the wedding photograph, at Eleanor's captured face, and felt the weight of certainty. Eleanor hadn't run away. Eleanor had asked too many questions, gotten too close to whatever truth lurked beneath James Blackwell's borrowed identity. That evening, when James returned home, he showed no surprise at the news. "Unfortunate," he said mildly, "though Eleanor always struck me as somewhat unstable. The stress of her finances, perhaps. Some women aren't equipped to handle such pressures." Catherine said nothing. She had learned that silence was safest around James. But she watched him, and he watched her, and between them the photograph sat like evidence at a crime scene. Sarah stayed in Bellwood for 2 weeks, desperately searching for her aunt. She brought Eleanor's confused letter to the police, but they dismissed it as the rambling of a troubled woman. She tried to tell them about the investigations into James Blackwell's past, but she had no proof. Eleanor's correspondence had disappeared along with her. One night, Sarah came to Catherine's house late, after James had gone to bed. Catherine met her at the back door, terrified they would be discovered. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Sarah whispered in the darkness of the kitchen. "Going back to Providence, but I wanted to tell you, I found something. In Eleanor's house, hidden in a floorboard, the police missed letters, dozens of them from women all over New England, women who responded to an advertisement Eleanor had placed in several newspapers." "What kind of advertisement?" "Asking if anyone else had been approached by a man offering to pay for arranged marriages, if anyone else had helped facilitate such unions." Sarah's voice shook. "Catherine, there were 12 responses. 12 women in 12 different towns who admitted to doing exactly what Eleanor did, finding young women from respectable but struggling families and connecting them to a wealthy man seeking to establish himself in their community." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice. 12? And that's just the ones who responded. How many others might there be? How many Catherine Morrisons has he collected? Sarah grabbed Catherine's hands. "You have to get away from him. Whatever he is, whatever he's doing, it's bigger than we thought. He's not just one man hiding from one crime. This is a pattern, a system. Where would I go? How would I survive? I don't know, but staying here." Sarah stopped as a floorboard creaked upstairs. Both women froze, listening. Nothing. But the moment was broken. Sarah pressed a piece of paper into Catherine's hand. "My address in Providence. If you ever need help, if you find a way to escape, come to me. I'll help you however I can." After Sarah left, Catherine unfolded the paper, memorizing the address before burning it in the kitchen stove. 12 women, 12 arrangements. How many of them had simply accepted their fates, lived out their lives as Mrs. whoever he claimed to be? And how many had asked questions, like Eleanor? The next morning, Catherine woke to find James sitting in a chair beside their bed, watching her sleep. It was barely dawn, pale light filtering through the curtains. "You were restless last night," he said softly. "Dreams? I don't remember. How strange. I thought I heard voices. Perhaps I was the one dreaming." Their eyes met, and Catherine saw the warning there. He knew. Whether he'd heard their conversation or simply intuited that Sarah would come to her, James knew they had been talking. "Eleanor was always troubled," James continued, standing and moving to the window. "Weak-minded, making up stories, seeing patterns where none existed. It's a shame she couldn't simply accept her situation and be grateful for the help I provided her family. But some people insist on digging where they shouldn't. What happened to her?" The question escaped before Catherine could stop it. James turned, and for just a moment his mask slipped. What looked out at her from his eyes was something cold and ancient, something that had worn many faces and destroyed many lives. Then he smiled, his empty smile. "She left," he said simply. "People do, sometimes. They just disappear into the world, start over somewhere new. It's easier than you'd think, actually, to simply become someone else. That was the last time Eleanor Whitmore's name was spoken in the house. The police investigation continued for another month, then quietly closed with a conclusion of voluntary departure. Sarah returned to Providence and never wrote. The letters she'd found disappeared. Whether Sarah took them or they were removed from Eleanor's house afterward, Catherine never knew. If you enjoyed this mystery, please leave a comment with your thoughts below. I'd love to know what you think happened to Eleanor and what secrets James is really hiding. Life continued in Bellwood as it always had. The Morrison debts remained paid. The general store prospered. James Blackwell was accepted by the town's better families, invited to dinners and socials, his past, whatever it actually was, buried beneath layers of respectability and money. And Catherine learned to wear her own mask, to smile and play the role of devoted wife. While inside, she catalogued every strange visitor, every unexplained absence, every moment when James's control slipped just enough to reveal the void beneath. The photograph remained on the mantelpiece. Catherine sometimes stood before it late at night, studying Eleanor's face, that captured moment of knowing. Her godmother had seen something in that instant before the shutter fell, some terrible understanding of what she had helped create, what she had unleashed on Catherine and perhaps countless others. Years passed, the photograph aged, the image fading slightly, though Eleanor's expression remained as clear as ever. Fear and guilt frozen forever. Catherine grew older, quieter, more like the other wives in town who had learned that survival meant silence. Mary married and moved away. Thomas Morrison died in 1918, never knowing the full truth of what his desperation had cost his daughter. And James Blackwell remained, unchanging, unaging somehow, moving through Bellwood society with his empty smiles and his careful lies. Sometimes Catherine wondered if he would simply leave one day, disappear as completely as he'd appeared, off to another town and another Eleanor and another desperate family to exploit. But he seemed content where he was, his legitimacy purchased and his secrets buried so deep they might never surface. The wedding photograph became a curiosity eventually, shown to visitors, pointed out in old family albums. "That's my grandmother," descendants might say someday, and her godmother Eleanor, who disappeared mysteriously. The story would become legend, then myth, the edges softening with time until only the image remained. A wedding in 1911, everyone smiling except one woman whose expression told a different story. What truth did Eleanor see in that moment? Who was James Blackwell really? What happened to the other 12 women in those other 12 towns? The photograph offers no answers. It only preserves that single instant when the camera captured something real, fear that proved justified, guilt that was deserved, and a mystery that would remain forever frozen in silver and light. Some secrets, the image seems to say, are too dangerous to speak. Some truths can only be glimpsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the moment before the shutter falls and everything becomes permanent. Eleanor's face knows what happened, what was happening, what would happen. But photographs can't talk. They can only watch, silent witnesses to truths too terrible for words. And perhaps that's what makes them most unsettling, not what they show, but what they refuse to tell. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more mysterious stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.